Travis went good, so. During the Trump administration, I found MSNBC because my local Fox News, Fox 13 News Utah, was not covering Trump. And I needed to know what Trump was up to. I tried Channel 2, National News, and then they came out with their robotic, in unison throughout the whole nation speech about how they are not pre-programmed to lie and deceive us. And so I found MSNBC, specifically Rachel Maddow, but that grew into the others. And it was refreshing for Rachel Maddow's show. She dug deep, and she's even criticized mockingly for her ability to see historical events tying to the current day situation. And that's what a good reporter is supposed to do. So it's kind of disturbing that others would mock her for that. Because it's not just about being given a script of what the company wants you to say, and then you robotically repeat it. I was concerned that the news agencies were all using the same code words but again, Rachel Maddow stood strong throughout that. And MSNBC generally spent the majority of their shows talking about the evils of Trump with his racism, sexism, bigotry, xenophobias of all types and kinds and hatreds, and his support of white supremacy, and support of terrorism, and support of enemy nations to attack America, to break it down and destroy it. And they were pointing out the misinformation and disinformation from Fox News, from Trump himself, and from the new emerging AON and Supermax News, or whatever it's called. And so, yeah, I was relieved to have a source of news I thought I could count on. Then Trump lost the election. Biden took over. And I don't recognize MSNBC anymore. They've changed. They're now the ones that are denying science. They're now the ones that are pushing segregated hate crimes. They're the ones that are misinforming and disinforming the public. Rachel Maddow's still standing strong through it all, though. Except for the shooting in Atlanta. She's reporting it, but not going into table round discussions on it, like the other shows do. If for some reason you don't know about the shooting in Atlanta, the liberal media is pushing hardcore that it's a perfect example of Asian racism, that the shooter was racist, and that his whole intention was to murder Asians. And they referred to the place as a spa because that's the title name of the business, something spa. And yet they're misinforming and disinforming the public as to what it actually is. It's not a spa that your moms go to get the facial wraps and the heated stones and the mud baths. It's not that kind of a spa. It's where the term happy ending comes from. And if you don't know, good for you for your sexual purity. But again, you're being misinformed and disinformed by your religion. And that is the real story with the Atlanta shooting. The guy came out and said that he was experiencing religious sexual guilt, as he claimed he had a sex addiction. The sex addiction was taught to him by his religion, which was incited by psychology. I don't know how many of you remember the 1980s, but during that decade, there was a religious homophobia that spread across the nation. Psychologists, which psychiatrists are the ones who are able to give drugs for behavioral control rather than curing anybody of anything, calling mental illness a fraud. Well, it is a fraud, but they claim it's a legitimate thing. But psychology was helping religion with their homophobia by religion referring those who desired to masturbate with men who desired to masturbate with other men. Now, if you don't understand what sex is, I'll have to instruct you on the definition. Asexual reproduction is reproduction without sex. So, like worms. If you've ever seen the movie Evolution with David Duchovny and the 7-Up guy from the old commercials, and some others, but they were looking in a jar of specimens that they had obtained that had been rapidly evolving at a non-scientific rate, but they had worm-like creatures that just split. That's asexual reproduction. There was no sex involved. Now, what is sex? Sex involves a female that has eggs and a male that has sperm. Sex is the process through which sperm joins with an egg and reproduces. Any other method without this process is masturbation. So there is no such thing as homosexual. It's not asexual reproduction. It's not even sexual reproduction. It's just masturbation. That's the anti-science denial of liberals. Nonetheless, religion demands that males and females abstain from their natural biological design by God. The very first commandment in Scripture is to have sex and reproduce. That's the very first commandment. Dallin H. Oaks is wrong when he says the first commandment is obedience. He's referring to the temple oaths of loyalty. That is not the first commandment. It's sex. Men are that they might have joy. And what are they talking about in the Book of Mormon? Sex with a female, reproducing, having children. And so there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about this by religion and by those who are resisting religion. And so psychology was doing electroshock therapy, as they called it. They were just electrocuting guys who desired to masturbate with other men, hoping that that would somehow cure them of being gay, which was the white supremacist abusive term for someone who desired to masturbate with other men. It came from the original definition of happy. And so those shock treatments failed and thus were stopped. Psychology for the Nation came out and said that homosexuality is no longer a mental illness for which someone needs to be drugged and electrocuted. The church, however, still likes that idea, but they consented and say, well, okay, we can sort of have other treatments. That was not too long ago, I think 2019. When the legislature here in Utah was debating it, whether to keep it going or to do away with it. And so this shooter confessed that he claimed to have a sex addiction, which, when you hear the word addiction, that's because a psychologist created it. If our bodies are naturally supposed to reproduce, it's not an addiction. I can assure each and every single woman out there, and every man who refuses to confess this, as Bill Clinton, Mr. Blowjob, used that as an excuse to explain his horniness, because he ain't getting nothing from Hillary. Theirs was just a business relationship. Men cannot be addicted to sex. An addiction is, say, an addiction to drugs. You shoot yourself up, or take a pill, or sniff something, whatever, and that chemically damages your brain. Causes you to hallucinate, go into a happy place, but there's damage being done to the brain. Thus, why in the late 80s they came out with, this is your brain on drugs, any questions? If you remember that commercial, to show you that drugs cause harm. We're not talking about marijuana, different subject matter, different response on the brain. It actually has therapeutic properties for those who have seizures, which cause the brains to slow down from its rapid pace. That's what causes seizures, is the brain all of a sudden intensifies and seizures result. So you need to slow down the brain in order for the seizures to subside and prevent future seizures. Thus, marijuana helps those who get seizures. And if you do it in the liquid form through a medical doctor, yeah, that's ideal, because you don't have the smoking effects that affect other people's lives who don't need to have their brain slowed. But drugs are an addiction because those feelings that you go through, despite the damage to your brain, triggers your body to demand more and more on a continuous cycle, so that when you don't shoot up, pop a pill or sniff for a certain period of time after the high, as you start to go down and you start to crash, your body is saying, I need more, give me more. And of course you've got to be rich in order to keep the supply going. Otherwise you become a junkie and you end up stealing, begging for money from others to feed your habit, to buy the drugs from your local dealer. And the drug dealers know this, and that's why they sell drugs. It's because it's an addictive product, similar to the tobacco industry, which got caught by the whistleblower, but they succeeded in destroying his life, whereas they got a temporary punishment of several $100 billion, so that the states could then do advertising, as the tobacco industry is still back up in business again, just with the warnings now. As the whistleblower's life, it's still destroyed. Isn't that great? And so, sex, as a natural biological function, would have to produce brain damage and allow a man to have sex non-stop, 24/7, in order to be counted as an actual addiction. So one, nope, no brain damage, it's a natural biological function. So all the psychologist claims, oh, the frontal lobe is activated, the pupils of the eyes dilate when you see a magazine. It's because of the color on the magazine. I ran that test. When I heard that, I said, wait a minute. I learned from art in high school that it's just color on paper. And so the Rorschach test that psychologists use, that's your only answer. I see black ink on white paper. That's it. That's all. That's the answer. Any other answer is wrong. But they want you to give those other answers so they can call you mentally ill. Sorry, Batman, you fell for that trick. If you remember the old Batman movies from the 80s, and it could have been the one in the 90s, but there was a quadrilogy of different Batmans during those early years. And the other part is what frustrates women. Because after a man orgasms, they roll over, go to sleep, or they go out for a smoke, or they go back to work, or they go back to their home. I'll call you. they're done, and the woman's left there with no cuddle. So if you've seen the movie Willow, and Mad Mortigan takes the dust of broken hearts. So again, don't do drugs. And he sees Sorsha. I mean, I don't need the dust of unbroken heart to, wow. Oh, that gorgeous red hair flowing all the way down her body. Oh, wow. No drugs needed. But yeah, he's confessing his undying love for her. You are my sun, my moon, my guiding star. Without you, I dwell in darkness. And she falls for it. And they're about to kiss when the tent collapses and all hell breaks loose. But she catches him later on in the movie, and he's tied on the back of her horse, and she decides, did you really mean the things you said in the tent? And he says, I don't know. It just went away. I was your sun, your moon, your guiding star. Without me, you dwelt in darkness, and it went away? Exactly. It is not an addiction. It is a natural biological function, which is for men. Women have theirs. And technically it is a symbol of the Messiah or Christ, depending on which religion. But to have religion not understand this and not teach it to their people is very disturbing. Because baptism, instead of teaching about women with the child in the womb encased in a water bubble that bursts and out emerges the child, which comes from the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, where the first commandment is given, have sex, reproduce. It's all being ignored and dismissed, as instead they all want to talk about, oh, this is why you have to be baptized into our religion, and it's about Jesus being resurrected and ascended to heaven. See, Christians are white supremacists. They've been so for a very long time. Who's responsible for murdering Jesus? No, it wasn't the Jews, because they didn't murder a guy that didn't exist. Constantine created the Christian God. He created a brand new Greek word. It had no meaning in Greek. Scholars to this day keep struggling to try to define it. They're all wrong because it's made up. Constantine created the Christian God of Trinity. So there was no Jesus in the Roman period. It's all made up. It's actually prophecies about the latter-day Messiah of the Jews. Matthew is the clue to that, because he's trying to convert Jews. But nonetheless, Christianity decides we're going to hate Jews because they murdered our God. Jews are also white supremacists for their treatment of blacks. Why are blacks colored? No, it had nothing to do with Cain. Again, white supremacism, doctoring records, calling them scripture from God to justify white supremacism in a religious context. And the church embraces this white supremacism of Christianity. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is why blacks didn't get the priesthood, because they're white supremacist. Had nothing to do about God wanting to protect the church from being picked on, because it's not acceptable in the world yet. No, Joseph Smith had no problems. Why did Brigham Young? Racism. And the church is also sexist, bigoted. They despise the poor. All of your white supremacism. And even in Mormonism, as they embrace Easter and the Easter Jesus rather than Passover and the Jewish Messiah, Mormons, as I was taught as well, believe that the Jews killed the Christ, who did not exist. It was created by Constantine. And we all know, even white supremacists know, that because of our biological design, when we see another human, if we're a male, we desire to mate with the female. Doesn't matter the color, the creed, the race, ethnic group, culture, the side of the street, side of the tracks. Our desire to breed takes precedence over our hatred. And so, many white supremacists have been shocked to find out when DNA started to become a thing. They got their DNA results back and they found that they had markers for blacks? Uh-oh. Yeah. I have one line on my mom's dad's side. They were North Carolina plantation owners and the slaves of those plantation owners. Because one particular paternal slave owner raped the teenage girl maternal ancestor. And thus I am now a descendant of that sexual affair. If we were to actually step out of our racism and white supremacy, we would see that women are just beautiful. They're designed to be beautiful, so that we can obey the very first commandment and reproduce. No science denials, no none of that. And so it's disturbing to hear MSNBC and other news talk about this shooting and purposely spin it to misinform and disinform the public, to think that it was a racially motivated attack, and to ignore The real news story, which is deeper, darker, and more ingrained in our culture, that of religious white supremacy, of a sexual guilt trip nature. Because he naturally desired to reproduce. But his religion said, you can't. You have to be married. And then only with the one you're married to. And you have to be an adult. Unless you're in certain states that allow for minors, as long as they got parental permission. And then some states allow cousins, first cousins, as in the case with Giuliani. And so you hear white supremacists downplay raping of 14-year-old girls as they justify it with, well, Mary was a 14-year-old girl when she had Jesus. Yeah, during those days, yes. When a woman was starting to bleed, that showed that she was ready to breed. Women did not have rights during those dark ages. They were sold as property. Joseph buys her. And so it's a huge error to impose the ancient practice onto our modern day, supposed to be enlightenment, where we're supposed to treat everyone equally. But everybody wants a trophy to be equal with everyone else. The news should be talking about how religion is so barbaric, so white supremacist, so abusive, and sexually depraved. Because that's what happens to religious people who are conflicted with their biological impulses and religious commandments. We have seen it here in Mormon, Utah. The results of abstinence-only education in the school systems, which were pushed by the church. And bishops and primary teachers and other members, even police officers who are Mormon, because of the misinformation and disinformation of white supremacist Mormonism, teaching them to feel guilty for their natural desires. Results in horrific crimes of not just human sex trafficking that was caught here in West Valley City by a Mormon returned missionary, of the people from the place that he was preaching the Mormon gospel to, but rapes, prostitution, and other sex trafficking. It's not shocking. It is very discouraging and disappointing. that the bishop who said, "Church, we need a set standard of questions to ask our youth in order to be found worthy for the temple. We cannot have bishops getting sexually explicit with children." He was excommunicated, but he was able to form a movement, Protect LDS Children, and got the church to finally do what they should have been done had they been a real church by a real God. The church wouldn't have to have been forced by the United States government with a quid pro quo of dropping the Edmunds-Tucker Act to allow blacks into the church and into the temples. Had they had a real God the whole time, rather than racist prophets. And women would still have the priesthood, rather than being deceived that they get the blessings of the priesthood from their husbands. That if the Relief Society was actually kept as a priesthood office. Had there been a real God that they were listening to and obeying, rather than being sexist prophets. Same for taking care of the poor. There would be no poor. 5.4 trillion estimated wealth, and yet there are still poor in the Mormon church, let alone in Utah, let alone in the nation, let alone in the world. 5.4 trillion could cure poverty. Pull everyone up and out of poverty. Had they been listening to a real God. And bigotry? Yeah, the church could have just come out and said, because it's their religious right in the First Amendment, to say, well, our religion is only for those who want to reproduce and have families. You can still worship God, you don't have to belong to our church. We're just exclusive to the family unit. And people would say, oh, okay. People would grow up in the church and say, oh, okay, so I'm free to leave and there will be no repercussions, there will be no retaliation, there will be no abuse for me leaving. Go ahead. We won't prevent you from obtaining a job here in Utah. We won't prevent you from purchasing goods and services here in Utah. Because there are 3 kingdoms of glory. And our church is just for the one that has reproduction. But nope. They've turned it into a heaven and hell. If you don't make it into the highest degree of glory, it's like being in hell. The abuse must stop. The lies, the deceptions, the misinformation, the disinformation, the cover-ups. The church claims to be the church of Jesus Christ. Yet they've put a wall so that people cannot walk on Temple Square and see on the Salt Lake Temple the symbol of the real God they worship. And I'll give you a hint, his name is not Jesus Christ. Even though Jesus Christ doesn't exist anyway. It's all a con. It's the inverted pentagram, if you didn't know, if you've not been watching my videos. Inverted pentagram is of Lucifer, defined by Isaiah, and is in the Book of Mormon. How art thou fallen from heaven? Falling star. The inverted pentagram. Right there on the keystone of the door of the temple. Which means that the doctrines of Lucifer are taught within. And so yes, Oakes is right. Lucifer's first commandment is obedience. Forced agency. Yeah, sure, you have the right to choose as long as you choose the right. If you choose wrong, you get punished. Now you understand why the church has a hard time with single mothers. They don't want people to have sex, but our biological function tends to break through that. And so then they separate the family by saying, well, you guys are too young. The boy's got a career ahead of him in football at BYU and his mission and a future prophetic role. And so it must be separated from the girl. She has to have the baby because you can't have an abortion. That's murder. But you can't keep the baby because you're a single mom. And we're making sure the government punishes you with economic hardship as a single mom. But hey, the church used to have an adoption agency for just such an occasion. Ooh, profiting off of what they cause. Wow. Yeah, they got out of that when complaints started to rise. Just like in the Boy Scouts. When complaints started to rise, they said, oh, we're out of the Boy Scouts now. See ya. Have fun with the lawsuits that have now destroyed the Boy Scouts. So yes, this is a disturbing topic. But it's disturbing because it's religion perpetuating this. And the liberal media is not covering it as they ought to.